Yeah,
You
that's
know,
interesting because I definitely went vegetarian as an ignorant teenager. I was ignorant in the best way, I guess. I truly didn't know, didn't have access to know. I was 15 years old and became vegetarian, and because I didn't want to benefit from the death of other animals, and of course, not realizing that eggs and dairy clearly you're benefiting from the death and torture of animals. But when I did, I guess, realize that, I started making efforts to try to I was trying so hard to get eggs from a special, special farmer, and cheese from a special dairy that only had names on all their cows. I tried so hard to do all that,
mm.
and it was a lot of effort to try to get ethical eggs and dairy. Luckily, I was living in Berkeley, California at the time, which is kind of known for its liberal ideals and freedom of speech. The free speech movement was there, and there were enough people around to kind of like
That was mentioned in Star Trek 4, the movie, wasn't it? Yeah,
they did. The free speech movement was mentioned in Star Trek 4.
yeah.
That's right.
It,
Yes.
it did it did a bit too much LDS.
Yeah. Too much LDS. Exactly. That's
But
so funny
actually,
you say that.
on a serious note, though, Sky, it's one that what you just said there is one of the problems that I've got with the modern vegan movement, with this big emphasis on talking about cruelty all the time. The word cruelty has become the dominant phrase that is used. And the importance of that is that sociologists see social movements as claims makers. So our language is incredibly important, which is why
Yeah, I've
we
seen you
try
lecture
and
about language before, and I enjoy it. So yeah.
yeah, we try and get people not to say it when they refer to other animals, those kind of things. And language in a social movement context is very important. So our language is important, and because cruelty has become our dominant word, it means that people do what you just said you did, which is seek out the non-cruel,
Right.
because we don't have a fundamental. Whereas Reagan says, well, cruelty to other animals is bad and it compounds the fundamental wrong, but it's not the fundamental wrong. The fundamental wrong is the fact that we're committing rights violations. But we've lost the ability, if we ever had it really, to make the case for animal rights. So we talk about cruelty. And even if you look at the Vegan Society definition, it says exploitation of and cruelty to. But most people just talk about cruelty. Whereas if
I
if they use that full phrase, that wouldn't be so bad, because words are not banned. I mean, obviously, people have talked about cruelty for years and decades and everything else. It's just that when it becomes the only word, you're in the welfare paradigm, and that's dangerous.
Yes, I totally agree with that last part you said. I think though with the cruelty is what colors the fairness, right? Why is something unfair? And the first thing you can look at is how cruel, for example, I remember the first time I thought about animals being treated unfairly, and it was because I found out what veal was when I was like 14 years old. I found out what veal parmesan was, and I'm like, what is veal? And I heard it was a baby cow locked in a box. Uh, and the person who told me was a chef, and he said, because I was working in a restaurant, and he said, "Doesn't seem fair, does it?" I'm like, "No, it doesn't seem fair." And he says, "No, that's." He says, "I don't eat veal. I couldn't bring myself to eat veal because it's so unfair how they're treated." And I
There's that
think,
word again, unfairness.
yeah, and the way you said fair, it brought me back to my 14-year-old self. The first time I thought about an animal be treating unfairly, and it was because of how cruel the act was. Right? How cruel is it to put a baby cow, separate it from its mother and stick it in a box and make because its flesh will be somewhat softer once we cut it open. So I think that cruelty is important to talk about, and
Well, yeah, but
also
you're just highlighting the task that we have. What we've got to do is translate, because everybody is against cruelty to other animals. Most people, vast majority of people.
right.
And so obviously there are some people who like doing it, but generally speaking, right? And
Mm.
so our job is to translate that into respect for them. And we do that by getting them to understand animal rights, which is that the other animals are rights bearers. And then when we use them, it's a rights violation. And if you can get them to jump from cruelty to that, their position is much, much, much stronger than just being anti-cruelty. So I've
Yes,
got no
I
objection to starting where you start, but you've got to push them
right.
on somewhere.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I can't help but agree with that. I mean, because that was me. You have these seeds, just like you said. You save the flying daddy long legs, and you have these moments that you can remember. Yeah, I remember finding out what veal was and being horrified. I remember finding out what goes into pepperonis and was horrified. When you see how the sausage is made at a young enough age, it does affect you because of because of what goes into it. And so then how did I get to animal rights was because the way I got to veganism was because I was against oppression. I was in a place where we were talking about violence and oppression a lot. There was a war going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if I'm going to be against violence and oppression and be this pacifist anti-war guy, then it just makes sense to not cause that against animals, because when it comes to bodily autonomy and things like that, which is a hot topic right now.
But you moved yourself on, though, didn't you, from just
Yeah.
an anti-cruelty situation, which is what we need to do. We can't afford to remain there, and we can't afford not to point out to people that there's a more fundamental problem than the thing they already agree with already. Don't be cruel is not a particularly difficult concept for people. It's just that don't be cruel doesn't mean veganism. That the modern vegan community has made a direct line in their imagination between the phrase "don't be cruel" or "have mercy" and veganism. But culturally,
Yes.
in terms of cultural speciesism, that link is not there. Don't be cruel means free range, and all the things that you said about 10 minutes ago.
Right. Right. And I think the realization, the mind-blowing aha moment or whatever I'm getting from you is that the people are already anti-cruelty. Like what you
Yeah,
said, the vast majority of people are
we're brought
already
up like that.
anti-cruelty.
Because cultural speciesism, one of the main planks of that is animal welfarism, the ideology of animal welfarism,
Yeah.
which is don't be cruel. But another part of that is that you shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering, which means that some suffering is necessary. So it's a bit complicated, but it's kind of quite simple as well. People are brought up not to be cruel, but that doesn't mean they can't eat them. And so
Right.
when you've got this thing about you can't be an animal lover and eat them, culturally you can, because that's what we taught.
Right. Culturally you can, but logically you can't, and it's one of those things where back to critical thinking again. You
But
need to
you've
make
got to
those
give them a
connections.
reason to say, okay, hang on, there's a problem there. You've got to give them a reason, so you've
Well,
got to shift the paradigm.
and those paradigms are shifted by pointing out hypocrisies, I think, and I think that's why so many non-vegans will try to find hypocrisy in the vegan argument, because at its base the vegan argument is pointing out hypocrisy. It's pointing out
Yeah,
it's
but again, though, Sky, if you remain in the love animals and don't be cruel thing, you're really deeply in the welfare paradigm. You've got to figure a way of jack in a box them out of that into somewhere else, because keeping them in there will keep them looking for the free range or the humane
right.
and all the rest of it. And we've got to break that cycle, which is just part of their socialization. It's not their problem. Well, it's not their fault really that they're
Mm,
cultural speciesists. They're born into a deeply culturally speciesist society, and they're brought up with all the values, and they're told not to question it. But it doesn't mean they can't eat them. And so
right.
I think that the idea that, oh, you can't be an animal lover because, of course, I mean, farmers and vivisectors aside, most people generally care about their animal companions, for example. And
Well,
so,
that's why,
so they
yeah,
might say they
pets.
love them, but that's nothing to do with what they eat in their imagination, because they're cultural speciesists.